Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my Week 14 running back rankings for the 2021 fantasy football season. On today's episode, of course, we're talking about all things related to the running back position, beginning with matchups. We'll talk about which defenses are giving up the most points to opposing running backs thus far this season on average in a half PPR scoring format. On a weekly basis, we typically go ahead and talk about the defensive matchups based on weeks 1 through 13. But what I've gone ahead and done is I've concentrated it to the last 6 weeks of the season in order to give ourselves a better idea as to which defenses are playing extremely well as of late, while others have declined over the last couple weeks and are giving up a bunch of points to opposing running backs in order to identify which matchups are the most advantageous going into this week. And we'll continue to do that for the entirety of this week's rankings and for the rest of the season as we get into the fantasy playoffs. So in order to give ourselves an idea as to who has the most upside based on said matchups, we'll talk about that. After we talk about matchups, of course, we're going to transition to our top 36 running back rankings as I'll share with you guys my thought process and opinions. We'll talk about last week's performances from running backs and how I think it's all going to stack up when it's said and done at the end of week 14. Now, before we get into all of that at the running back position, I want to remind you, if you have not yet already, subscribe to the channel. We are on our way to 58,000. If you guys have not yet already, we're making fantasy football content for the entirety of the season, so make sure to subscribe to help yourself win a 2021 fantasy football championship. And if you guys could, clicking that like button down below certainly does help out the channel a lot. I greatly do appreciate that. Also, if you haven't checked out Underdog Fantasy, it's another way to play fantasy football and take advantage, despite the fact that the season is coming to an end. There's other ways to go ahead, draft teams, have fun on a weekly basis, regardless of what the game is. I mean, even though last night's game was relatively, unappealing to many of us, considering it was a lower scoring game and a defensive slugfest between those two teams in a weather game, I found myself having a lot of fun, mainly because prior to the game starting, I saw that the weather was going to be horrible. So I went ahead, I went over to Underdog Fantasy and I drafted a team of full running backs because I knew this is going to be a game with 60-mile-per-hour winds, with weather concerns, that no one's going to be able to comfortably pass the ball in. And therefore, I went ahead, drafted a team with a $7 buy-in, was able to get myself $40, got myself tied for 12th place. But if I had gotten a couple breaks here and there, another player in this draft that had come down to me, I would have been in an even better position. But hey, I don't mind taking home $40 at the end of last night. So again, check out Underdog Fantasy. Use promo code Andrew today. If in fact you use that code, Underdog Fantasy is willing to match up to $100 of your first deposit. You drop $100, they're going to give you $100, get you ready to win some money and have some fun at Underdog. Thank you. Now that we've covered all that, let's go ahead and transition right into the topic of the running back position, beginning with matchups. Of course, as we typically do, we talk about how many points defenses are giving up to opposing running backs thus far this season on average in a half PPR scoring format, meeting everyone in the middle, whether you do play in a full PPR scoring format or a standard league. On the very left side of the screen, we have weeks 8 through 13 running back fantasy points allowed. So as you can see, the New York Jets on an average per weekly basis are giving up 30 fantasy points to opposing running backs, which means, of course, the New Orleans Saints backfield certainly has an incredible matchup this week, followed by the Pittsburgh Steelers, who have absolutely fallen from grace. A defense who once imposed fear in me in terms of starting my respective fantasy prospects against them has now become one of the better matchups on a weekly basis, as that defense cannot stop opposing running backs, followed by Seattle Seahawks, Las Vegas Raiders, Houston Texans. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, of course, we have the Miami Dolphins, Baltimore Ravens, Philadelphia Eagles, Los Angeles Rams as defenses that you don't really want to mess with. Though they are giving up a fair amount of points as of late, these teams have not given up many touchdowns, if any, to opposing running backs. That has definitely been the case for the Miami Dolphins and the Baltimore Ravens, who have completely shut out the running back position over the last 6 weeks of the season. Either way, just giving you some perspective there. As we move on to the right of that, we have weeks 8 through 13 running back rushing stats allowed. Just giving you some perspective as to how many yards and rushing touchdown points are being allowed from these respective teams. If in fact you have a running back on your team that does not have the capacity of playing on that third down and getting that upside, of course, then you can go ahead and take advantage of some of these teams that are just giving up a boatload of points on the ground, specifically like the Houston Texans, who will take on the Seattle Seahawks this week. If in fact Adrian Peterson, Rashad Penny can find themselves in a scenario where they're both given 10 plus carries similar to last week, perhaps against the Houston Texans front seven, they will have themselves an even better performance this week and have themselves incredible upside. Just wanted to kind of throw that out there. The stats are on the screen to help you guys out and give you more information so you can make an educated decision as to who you're going ahead and starting and sitting going into this week. Now that we've talked about our week 14 matchups, of course, we'll transition back to the main screen and talk about our top 36 running back rankings. Again, do not forget, rankings are subject to change. I talk about it every week. There are going to be running backs that are going to shuffle throughout the week, whether it is a running back missing because of injury, illness, perhaps a running back coming back from an injury. We'll go ahead, we'll keep that all monitored. But as a whole, just remember, nothing here is final. This is Tuesday. On Sunday, we'll have a live stream, 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, in order to help you guys out, set your lineups, and get ready to win and get into our 2021 fantasy playoffs. All right, let's get into this, beginning with our top 12. Again, you're starting all these players regardless, but either way, if you wanted to pick out, a couple here and there, considering maybe some of you have more than 2 of these players, let's talk about it. Beginning with our number 1, it is Alvin Kamara. Alvin Kamara has missed the last 4 weeks of the NFL season due to a knee injury. Now, instead of them placing him on the injured reserve, they went ahead and they had him just on the regular team. And though he was inactive on Sundays, they had the hopes that potentially he could return. Now, last week he was limited throughout practice the entire week prior to the Dallas Cowboys game, but did not give it a go. I believe that this week against the New York Jets, the easiest matchup at the position, he will be active and ready to play. Now, with Taysom Hill at the quarterback position, it certainly does limit the total upside of an Alvin Kamara, considering how much value he gets in terms of receiving the ball out of the backfield. But with that all being said, it's such an advantageous matchup. And the fact that Alvin Kamara has been out for so long, a month now, I believe he's going to be ready to go. He's going to be back into the lineup and delivering some great fantasy performances. Prior to his absence and his injury, of course, in the first 8 games of the 2021 season, in a half PPR scoring format, this man was averaging 17.75 fantasy points per game. And let's not forget, the New York Jets, they have given up 20 performances of 10 plus fantasy points to opposing running backs this season already. I don't think it's going to stop anytime soon. Alvin Kamara is a fantastic play at our number 1. Moving on to Alexander Mattison, our number 2. Like I mentioned, the Pittsburgh Steelers defense has been horrible as of late. I mean, in terms of the performances they've recently given up, Austin Ekeler went for 38.5 points against them. Mixon went for 30.3 on them. Devonta Freeman this last week, 18.2. And just a couple weeks back against the Detroit Lions defense, Detroit went for 227 rushing yards and 2 rushing touchdowns between their 3 running backs. I mean, just an incredible amount of points dropped on this defense that was once known for being one of the best run-stopping defenses in the National Football League. All season long have heavily struggled in terms of stopping what they were once great at. Now, Alexander Mattison, of course, like we all know, is an incredible running back. Thus far this season already, in the games in which he's stepped in for the absent Dalvin Cook, he's been averaging over 20 fantasy points per game, coming off of a week in which he had 19.9 points in a half PPR scoring format with 22 total rushing attempts, 3 receptions. Anytime you're given elite level opportunity, of course, the production is going to follow. I think despite the fact that it is the Pittsburgh Steelers, we know they have been horrible in terms of stopping the run. The Minnesota Vikings have been a run-first team, and with Mattison ready to go on Thursday night, I believe it's going to be a great game for him. Moving on to our number 3, we have Joe Mixon. Now, like I mentioned a little bit earlier, he has had some great performances over the last couple weeks. Now, despite the fact that he only ended up with 9.4 fantasy points, unfortunately fumbled late in that game, which ended up in a scoop and score that pretty much picked apart their team. Of course, Joe Burrow dealing with a little bit of a hand injury. It all fell apart against the Los Angeles Rams. With all that said, let's not forget how great Joe Mixon has been for our fantasy teams as of late and why we're continuing to start him, especially against the team that is giving up the 10th most points to opposing running backs as of late, which is the San Francisco 49ers. In the 4 games prior to Week 13, Joe Mixon was unstoppable. Not only was he putting up 23 plus fantasy points in every single game, but he was scoring 2 touchdowns in each of those games. Now, going into this upcoming week, again, with Joe Burrow's hand being a little bit busted, of course, and it is his throwing hand, there's a potential that they're going to continue to lean upon the running game, which, of course, has been their overall success in the second half of their season. On top of that, the San Francisco 49ers have given up 8 touchdowns to opposing running backs since Week 9. I think this is a complete, perfect recipe for success. Joe Mixon is going to be handed off the ball consistently, and with the fact that, of course, the San Francisco 49ers have struggled against running backs, Joe Mixon should have a great week here. Moving on to Austin Ekeler, the number 2 overall running back in fantasy as it currently stands, who has scored 15 total touchdowns this season already. What an unbelievable statistic. Of course, he surpassed 1,100 all-purpose yards, but going into this upcoming weekend's matchup against the New York Giants, they're about, the middle of the pack in terms of giving up points to opposing running backs, but I'm not too worried about it, considering how consistent Austin Ekeler has been as of late. In the last 4 consecutive games, he has scored a singular touchdown minimum. On top of that, in the last 3 games, he's had a minimum of 5 receptions in each of those contests. When he goes into this upcoming weekend's matchup against the New York Giants, against a team that may not have Daniel Jones, may not have Mike Glennon, and perhaps will be playing a 3rd-string quarterback, this should be all Los Angeles Chargers all day long, in which they should be dominating this defense and continuing to put it on them, as they'll have a lot of opportunities in the short field positioning, considering, of course, that New York Giants offense is going to have a real struggle moving the ball. With that being the case, and of course, Austin Ekeler being a 3-down back for this team and continuing to get a lot of work on the ground through the air, he is a perfect play as this week's number 4. Moving on to number 5, we have Najee Harris, another one of these running backs playing on Thursday night. Again, Najee Harris, though he has had underwhelming performances as of late, 13.2 fantasy points really isn't that bad considering they took on the Baltimore Ravens this last week. In all honesty, that is a great performance considering how well that defense has played in terms of stopping the run as of late. With this all being said, the Minnesota Vikings defense this last week against the Detroit Lions did not look great. Of course, they were dealing with a bunch of injuries. A lot of those players are going to return. Eric Kendricks, their middle linebacker, Anthony Barr, their outside linebacker, a couple of their cornerbacks will be returning. So this defense will be recovered in comparison to what we've seen in the past. That all being said, as of late, this Minnesota defense, even with their studs in the lineup, haven't been able to stop the run. Elijah Mitchell, a couple weeks back, 133 rushing yards and a rushing touchdown, while Deebo Samuel in that same game went for 66 rushing yards and 2 rushing touchdowns. They cannot stop the run. This is something that has plagued this team for the last couple of years, and I absolutely believe if this team wants to get back to success and the Pittsburgh Steelers want to continue to pick up wins here in Ben Roethlisberger's final year, Najee Harris is going to have to be the catalyst of this offense, continuing to lead them to success. I think that'll be the case as our number 5 this week. Moving on to our number 6, we have Javonte Williams. Now, it may be a little crazy to have Javonte Williams at this position, but let me just go ahead and preface. If, in fact, Melvin Gordon is going to miss another week here, I think Javonte Williams is an incredible top 6 play, to say the very least, beginning with the fact that he plays against the Detroit Lions defense. Of course, as of late, Mattison, 19.9 points against them. Nick Chubb, 21.4 fantasy points against them. I think there's a lot of opportunity to be given to a running back like Javonte Williams, considering, of course, he's coming off of a week in which he had 29 total touches out of this backfield, 26.8 fantasy points. He was quite literally the number 1 overall running back in a half PPR this last week. If Javonte Williams is going to have number 1 opportunity once again here, and where he's getting 25 plus touches, by all means, we all know he is talented enough and he has proven that he can find the end zone and score a bunch of fantasy points for our teams, and that is why he sits as our number 6. Moving on to number 7, Antonio Gibson, our thumbnail for today's video. Of course, Antonio Gibson is a stud, but he takes on the Dallas Cowboys this week, and many of us may be a little bit worried considering Dallas is giving up like the 5th fewest points to opposing running backs. I'm not too concerned about it, mainly because Antonio Gibson has had himself a fair share of games against the Dallas Cowboys where he has absolutely dominated that defense back in 2020. His 2 performances consisted of 34.1 fantasy points and the other game 20.5 fantasy points. There have been just unbelievable games that this man has put forth. Of course, one game in which he had 3 rushing touchdowns. I think that was the Thanksgiving game last year. And another game in which he had 128 yards and a touchdown, 5 catches. The fact that he is getting as much opportunity as he has over the last couple weeks. Of course, the Monday night game against Seattle Seahawks, 36 total touches this last week, had himself 23 rushing attempts, 5 catches out of this backfield, 28 touches is elite opportunity. And of course, it's going to lead to success as he was able to put up 19 fantasy points. I think Antonio Gibson against Dallas, he has their number. This is going to be a closer matchup than a lot of people think. And maybe if in fact Washington's able to command a lead here, Gibson may be even a better play as our number 7 this week. Moving on, we have Leonard Fournette. Playoff Lenny, Lombardi Lenny is taking over, and he's completely just dominating on a weekly basis. Besides the fact that, of course, he's getting great opportunity, he is dominating in the receiving game. In the last 4 weeks, he has had 28 total receptions. When this man is going to get the ball this many times, of course it's going to lead to success. 7 receptions per week on average is insane numbers. Just for a wide receiver, much less a running back. Tom Brady has injected even more fantasy value into his overall level, and it's just continuing to make him a better play. Since week 4, Leonard Fournette is the number 4 overall running back in fantasy football. Not only that, they take on the Buffalo Bills this week. The Buffalo Bills giving up the 11th most points to opposing running backs. Just last night on Monday Night Football, the New England Patriots made it a statement to use 6 offensive linemen and quite literally run the ball 38 times on that defense until they pretty much fell apart. I can only imagine what would have possibly happened if, in fact, Damien Harris didn't go down with an injury. Ramondre Stevenson was still good, but holy moly. Either way, I think Leonard Fournette has himself a lot of baseline value. His floor is extremely high, and with the amount of touchdowns this team continues to score in a matchup in which it should be a higher scoring one between these 2 teams, Leonard Fournette's a fantastic play. Moving on, we have Elijah Mitchell, our number 9. Now, though Elijah Mitchell was hit with an elbow, was completely knocked out, was sent to the blue tent, came back into the game. It looked like he really did have a potential concussion there. He currently is in the league's concussion protocol, but he did return to the game. He had his 3rd consecutive game of over 25 touches. I mean, that in itself, the opportunity is elite. And he plays against Cincinnati Bengals, giving up the 7th most points to opposing running backs as of late. Of course, Austin Ekeler had himself a nice 15-point game in a one-sided affair there in the second half. But all things considered, I think there's a very good chance that Elijah Mitchell does play this week with Trey Sermon on the injured reserve, with Jeff Wilson Jr. dealing with an inflamed knee. Of course, it is the same knee that he had surgery on. And of course, JaMychal Hasty being completely MIA as of late. I think there's a very good chance that Elijah Mitchell continues on his streak of running the ball consistently and finding a lot of fantasy value. Moving on to Cordarrelle Patterson, our number 10. I think Cordarrelle Patterson, again, he's pretty much 10 points every single week. And with Calvin Ridley continuing to be out, of course, he's going to continue to see himself more opportunities lining up out wide. And out of the backfield, of course, though he got a touchdown stolen from him, from Mike Davis, it was pretty much a revenge from the last time these two teams played. Of course, Cordarrelle Patterson had his breakout game stealing a touchdown from Mike Davis. All in all, we're not too worried about it. Going into this upcoming weekend's matchup, they take on the Carolina Panthers. They're giving up the 12th most points to opposing running backs as of late. And the last time we saw Cordarrelle Patterson against this defense, 5 catches on 5 targets, 37 yards and a touchdown, 15.7 fantasy points. Of course, had a little bit of a sprinkle of 9 carries for 35 yards in that contest. Overall, I think there's a very good chance that Cordarrelle Patterson is going to succeed. I mean, running the ball last week against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers was honestly his highlight of the week. It wasn't even in the receiving game where he had his explosion of opportunity. I think Cordarrelle Patterson is becoming just really one of the better running backs in the National Football League, on top of the fact that, as of late, the Carolina Panthers, they gave up 108 yards and 2 touchdowns to Miami's running backs, and of course, 164 total rushing yards to the Washington Football Team running backs. There's a lot of potential here for Cordarrelle Patterson. Moving on to David Montgomery, our number 11. David Montgomery finally clicked. I mean, the last couple weeks, for those of us who started him under my, discretion, of course, we're a little bit disappointed, but finally he's getting back on track, and I think this is where we begin to see the wave of David Montgomery taking over in the fantasy football playoffs, similar to the way that he did last year. Of course, coming off of a 24-point week in which his offense threw 4 interceptions, but was still able to put up 90 total yards on the ground, 8 catches for 51 through the air, a rushing touchdown, a great overall performance, to say the very least. Now, the Chicago Bears do take on the Green Bay Packers this week, and though the Green Bay Packers have been great in terms of stopping the run as of late, this is a team in which, of course, the Chicago Bears have found their success in the last couple seasons, mainly because they're a division rival, and they know how to exactly approach it on a weekly basis. Specifically, earlier this season, we saw Khalil Herbert have himself a great game against this defense in which he put up 18.2 total fantasy points. Last year in 2020, in the 2 contests that David Montgomery took on the Green Bay Packers, he put up 23.7 and 22.8 total fantasy points. As of late, running backs like Darrell Henderson, 15.3 fantasy points, and Dalvin Cook, 21 total fantasy points, have shown that this team can certainly be ran upon. I think David Montgomery, full steam ahead, is going to be a great play this week, regardless of who's at the quarterback position for the Chicago Bears. Should be a great play. Moving on, we have James Conner as our number 12. Again, James Conner has just been unbelievable in fantasy football. 14 total touchdowns this season already. Takes on the Los Angeles Rams. They have been incredible in terms of stopping the run as of late. They've given up the least yards per carry average over the last 6 weeks of the season. But is that going to stop James Conner from having himself a successful week? I don't think so. I think James Conner and the value that he continues to present on a weekly basis has to do with the fact that, of course, Chase Edmonds is still injured and probably won't be playing this week. And James Conner is getting over 20 touches per game. And in my opinion, as long as that continues to be the case, he is going to be an extremely valuable prospect, which we have seen over the last month. With that being said, the last time these two teams played, James Conner had himself 50 rushing yards, 2 touchdowns, 2 catches for 16 yards, 18.6 fantasy points, while Chase Edmonds had himself 120 rushing yards on 12 carries for 13.9 fantasy points. There's been a lot of success against this defense from the Arizona Cardinals recently, and I don't think James Conner is going to be leaving us out to dry. I think he's going to have a great performance this week. Moving on to our RB2 conversation, beginning with Josh Jacobs, our number 13. Josh Jacobs has been incredible as of late, having back-to-back performances of over 15 plus fantasy points. We will take that. And considering Kenyon Drake is going to be missing the rest of the season with a broken ankle, of course, Jalen Richard is going to be missing some time. We have an opportunity here in which Josh Jacobs is going to dominate the receiving work finally for this organization. Again, he had himself 9 targets, 9 catches this last week. Of course, he is going to have incredible fantasy upside, especially in a full PPR, if this is going to continue to be the case, and I'm hoping it's going to be. The last time the Las Vegas Raiders took on the Kansas City Chiefs, of course, it was a little bit of a struggle game. Of course, the Las Vegas Raiders weren't able to move the ball very much in the first half, and Patrick Mahomes had himself a 5-touchdown game. It was a one-sided affair. Josh Jacobs had less than 8 total rushing attempts in that game. When you're in that kind of a situation, of course, the running back position completely is eliminated. And hopefully that's not going to be the case this week, as we'll see Josh Jacobs more involved in the passing game, will continue to increase his overall value, find the end zone once again for the third consecutive week, and find himself a great overall position in fantasy. Moving on to Nick Chubb, our number 14. Now, you may have been wondering, where is Nick Chubb, Andrew? Well, here's my concern. He takes on Baltimore. He took them on in week 12. He had himself a horrible performance overall, as he only had 8 total rushing attempts, and this offense could not move the ball in any sort of capacity outside of throwing it to Jarvis Landry, who had over 100 receiving yards. I think, of course, Nick Chubb is going to be a great prospect, but here's my issue. With Kareem Hunt back and in a healthy position considering the bye week they're coming off of, I think Nick Chubb's opportunity is going to be a little bit lesser than we anticipate, and that is why I have him at number 14. Though we have seen him, especially in 2020, have great performances of over 80 rushing yards and 2 touchdowns against this Baltimore Ravens defense. As of late, this defense is nothing that you want to mess with, one that is stopping every running back in their tracks. I think it's going to be difficult for Nick Chubb, but I do give the benefit of the doubt to their offensive line and their running scheme that they will find success enough to make Nick Chubb a valuable RB2 this week. Moving on, we have our number 15, Aaron Jones. Speaking of a similar scenario, but the issue with Aaron Jones isn't that A.J. Dillon is my concern. It's a matter of whether or not he's going to be at a full capacity. Of course, he's coming off that MCL injury. He was limited the last time we saw him as they took on the Los Angeles Rams. And obviously, he didn't play at a full capacity because they wanted to just get him a couple touches. If he is at a full capacity against the Chicago Bears, I think very easily he could be a top 12 running back. But we won't know that until we, of course, see the practice reports as the week progresses and we get to Friday and know exactly what kind of Aaron Jones we are going to see in the matchup. Either way, we know what kind of value he has. He is a touchdown machine. He gets a lot of PPR work, and based on the amount of touches that Aaron Jones has seen earlier this year, and of course what A.J. Dillon was able to do with those kind of opportunities as of late, we know that the RB1 of this team has incredible value. So Aaron Jones, of course, if he's ready to play, he's in our lineup. Moving on to Sony Michel and or Darrell Henderson. I want to preface that if in fact Darrell Henderson is starting, of course he is in this position, but if in fact they're going to give him another week off, because he was active but literally didn't touch the ball. So in order to be a little bit precautious, I'll go ahead and suggest Sony Michel playing against the Arizona Cardinals, giving up the 6th most points to opposing running backs as of late. Of course, Sony Michel coming off of a week in which he had 121 rushing yards, a touchdown, 4 targets, 3 receptions, 20.4 total fantasy points. Arizona, as of late, they haven't been great either in terms of stopping running backs. Christian McCaffrey, 21 points against them. David Montgomery this last week, 24 points against them. Whoever the starting running back is for the Los Angeles Rams is going to find success here, as this defense, their secondary has been playing extremely well. But in terms of stopping the run, that has been their biggest weakness, and hopefully whoever the Rams running back is will be able to find some success there this week. Moving on to Clyde Edwards-Helaire, our number 17. I think Clyde Edwards is in a great position considering they take on the Las Vegas Raiders. We talk about it all the time. They're giving up a ton of points to opposing running backs. They're giving up the 4th most in the last 6 weeks of the season. Gibson this last week, 19.6. Mixon the week prior, 24.3. Of course, Clyde Edwards this last week was dealing with a little bit of an illness during the practice week and was questionable to play. He did get activated, but was splitting some touches with Darrel Williams. There's a reason why Darrel Williams found himself relevant enough to have a decent, total fantasy point contribution. That being said, CEH still had himself 14 carries and 3 catches, 17 touches in a game in which he was relatively limited. Is a great overall thing to see, because those numbers are only going to increase, and as they do, the rushing opportunities down in the red zone increase. And if you're going into a matchup against the Las Vegas Raiders, in which we've seen, of course, as of late, the Kansas City Chiefs in the last 6 matchups against this team have averaged over 35 total points as an offense. I think there's a great chance for Clyde Edwards to score. Moving on, we have Saquon Barkley, our number 18. If in fact we are going to see a 3rd-string quarterback starting for the New York Giants, I think Saquon Barkley would probably have a safe floor of maybe like 8 to 10 points, mainly purely off of receiving work. Of course, if in fact it's going to be a backup quarterback, he's probably going to want to check it down, similar to the way that Mike Glennon did this last week. 9 targets, 6 receptions, only 19 yards. Yes, that's brutal, but nonetheless, as long as you're continuing to catch the ball out of this backfield, your baseline of value continues to increase. This is a team, like we've seen all season long, wants to run first with Freddie Kitchens at the offensive coordinator position. They're going to continue to do so. Hopefully, it'll break out a little bit more for Saquon Barkley as he takes on an easier matchup than last week against Miami, who has been the best run-stopping defense in the last 6 weeks. Nonetheless, I think Saquon, coming off of 5.5 yards per carry, could end up having himself a decent week here if the quarterback position is figured out. Moving on to Chuba Hubbard, our number 19. Again, like I mentioned yesterday during the waiver wire video, if you haven't checked that out, be sure to do so. The last time he took on the Atlanta Falcons was in week 8. He had 24 carries, 82 yards, a touchdown, 1 catch for 9 yards, 13.9 fantasy points. All in all, He was a great overall participant in that matchup and got himself and his fantasy managers a great amount of points. Now, the question is, can he duplicate a very similar performance this week with Cam Newton at the quarterback position in comparison to Sam Darnold the last time we saw it? And of course, Ameer Abdullah getting more and more opportunity as the weeks have gone by. There is a possibility that Chuba Hubbard misses out on a touchdown, doesn't get enough receiving work, and that could lower his overall value. But with that all being said, the best way to beat this defense is, of course, just running it right through them. And I think Chuba Hubbard will be the hammer this week that they certainly do need to get the Carolina Panthers back on track. Moving on to James Robinson, our number 20. James Robinson is certainly injured. You can tell when he's running. You can tell based on the fact that they're not playing him in a full capacity. And even Urban Meyer said it was stupid of him to run him in the fourth quarter when they knew the game was practically over. As of late, again, the Tennessee Titans defense has been great, though we've seen a lot of success from James Robinson as of late against that organization. I'm still concerned about the possibility in which James Robinson is at a limited capacity. We'll see how the practice schedule works, but even if he does play, I'm a little concerned based on the fact that he just isn't 100% healthy. And when you're not, and you're playing on a team that, of course, can get down, pretty quickly in the game script disappears from you, his overall fantasy value could diminish relatively quickly. Moving on to our number 21, we have Devonta Freeman. Now, in the last 7 games that he has played, he's been averaging 12.43 fantasy points per game. Of course, that is when Latavius Murray went down with an injury, and of course, he took over the starting position of this backfield. In that span of time, he's been the number 13 overall running back in fantasy. So consistency has certainly been there. And based on his performances as of late, we have seen that week over week, coming off of an 18-point fantasy performance with the most targets he has seen all season long. And of course, 5 catches for 45 yards. The fact that Lamar Jackson targeted running backs out of the backfield 10 times this last week, including, of course, Latavius Murray and Devonta Freeman's overall contributions, makes me think that, of course, the running back position in this backfield continues to gain value every single week. They take on Cleveland. They're giving up the 8th most points to opposing running backs. Though Freeman in week 12 didn't find much success, I think it'll be a little bit of a different conversation considering, of course, Lamar Jackson is not going to be throwing 4 interceptions. And, of course, this offense will look certainly better than it has in weeks past. Moving on to our number 22, Ezekiel Elliott. Again, in the last 6 consecutive games, he has had 51 or fewer rushing yards. It has been extremely unfortunate to see that Ezekiel Elliott, though he once was a monster, has fallen to whatever this contribution is. I can't even tell you how much it saddens me to see Ezekiel Elliott not be a weekly stud running back. Coming off of a 5.7 fantasy performance, okay, that was a little bit of an anticipated game performance based on the fact that, of course, they took on New Orleans, but it is upsetting nonetheless. That all being mentioned, as of late, the one thing that has been the savior of Ezekiel Elliott has been touchdowns and receiving work. In the last 6 games, in which, of course, he has had that span of time of not getting over 51 rushing yards in a single contest, he's been averaging about 4 receptions per game and getting a fair share of touchdowns. And that's pretty much all you can hope for. Catching the ball 4 times in a singular game, getting about 40 to 50 rushing yards, scoring a touchdown, getting 12 to 13 fantasy points, that is our hope. And maybe that is the upside of an Ezekiel Elliott performance. And the reason he continues to play despite being injured is because we all know that Tony Pollard could very easily take his job and get Ezekiel Elliott out of Dallas in the coming years if he, steps up and has those kind of great performances like he did last week. Nonetheless, Zeke is a great option, mainly because the opportunity is still there. But once that opportunity, diminishes and disappears, he's going to be in trouble. Moving on to Jamaal Williams. Though Jamaal Williams didn't have the greatest game, he still had great opportunity. 18 total touches in a game that they won and scored 29 points. Very easily could have meant that Jamaal Williams breaks out a run, scores a touchdown, and finds himself an even greater fantasy point contribution for your fantasy teams. Nonetheless, they take on the Denver Broncos this week, a middle-of-the-pack overall defense in terms of stopping opposing running backs. I think Jamaal Williams, as long as he is the starter and there is no DeAndre Swift, he's going to continue to see 18 to 25 touches per game, whether it is on the ground or through the air. And as long as that's the case, of course, the touchdowns will follow. The receiving work will continue to grow and make his baseline and floor of production that much higher than a lot of these other running backs in the National Football League, because opportunity continues to lead to success on a weekly basis. Moving on to our final running back in the top 24 conversation, it is Kareem Hunt. Again, we got to respect this man. Prior to his injury, he was averaging like 15 fantasy points per game, averaging a touchdown per game. If he gets back to that kind of level of play, of course, we're going to regret not starting him, and I think he eventually will. Of course, coming off of the bye week, he is going to be fully healthy. Of course, he participated in that Week 12 game against the Baltimore Ravens last time they took them on. And of course, wasn't given that much opportunity, but they were just easing him back in. And hopefully, will be at a full capacity to help contribute not only on the ground, but through the air, because they desperately need to get the ball out of Baker Mayfield's hands. I think there's a very good chance that Kareem Hunt has himself a great performance and is a good top 24 play. Let's talk about our RB3 conversation, beginning with some backup running backs that may have some value based on the fact that their starters maybe, have been slowing down as of late due to injuries or other things, or perhaps maybe A.J. Dillon takes over in the second half, considering Aaron Rodgers could have a game in which he's completely blowing out the Chicago Bears defense. A.J. Dillon cleans up the second half work, finds himself in the end zone. There may be some value to be had there, and that is why we continue to talk about running backs at this capacity, because despite the fact that Aaron Jones will be leading the pack, A.J. Dillon could very certainly, like we've seen in weeks past, even with Aaron Jones having dominant performances, come out with 10 plus points with garbage time work that very easily can leave him as a top 25 play. Moving on to Tony Pollard at number 26, in the same capacity. If in fact we see a game in which, of course, Zeke is not playing up to par, Tony Pollard is going to be asked to come into the game and to contribute, whether it is in special teams, through the passing game on the ground. He's had himself great performances, and though the touches aren't there to the capacity of an A.J. Dillon, I think there's a very good chance that Tony Pollard gets more and more work as the weeks go by here and as Zeke continues to fall apart. Moving on, our number 27 is Devonta Freeman. We talked about him yesterday in the waiver wire episode, along with Dontrell Hilliard, both of the Tennessee Titans. I think both these running backs are going to have great games, mainly because they take on the Jacksonville Jaguars. When we have Sony Michel going for 120 yards on the ground, scoring a rushing touchdown early in that contest, and continuing to dominate that defense, of course, why not go ahead and trust in running backs who both ran for over 100 yards the last time they played? And last time they played against the New England Patriots defense, which is no joke. So Devonta Freeman, Dontrell Hilliard. I think Hilliard does have more upside in a PPR scoring format, but in a half PPR, I'll rank it as such. Our number 27 and number 28, both Tennessee Titans backfield members that are going to have themselves great weeks here. Moving on to Mark Ingram, our number 29. Like I've always mentioned, the Jets defense, they've given up 20 performances of over 10 points this season. If not only is Alvin Kamara going to have a great game, Taysom Hill going to run the ball like he did last week, and Mark Ingram going to contribute in this backfield, why not Mark Ingram getting himself a couple carries on the ground, maybe even a late touchdown in which they continue to pour it on this defense? Mark Ingram is a very talented running back, and though he's been dealing with injuries as of late and some tougher performances because of the matchups, I think this one sets him up for success, leaves him at our number 29. Moving on to Rex Burkhead, with, of course, David Johnson dealing with an injury and Phillip Lindsay now on the Miami Dolphins. Rex Burkhead has been pretty much tasked with the idea that he has to be the starter of this team. With that all mentioned, of course, it hasn't been all rainbows and sunshine in terms of opportunity. Only 8 total rushing attempts and 1 catch this last week with Tyrod Taylor, and then, of course, Davis Mills at the quarterback position due to the injury. Going into this weekend's matchup, it is against the Seattle Seahawks. Seattle secondary has been playing well, but in terms of stopping the run, they have been able to do none of that. They cannot stop tight ends, and they cannot stop the run, giving up the 3rd most points to opposing running backs in the last 6 games. I think Rex Burkhead certainly is going to have opportunity, and that's all you can ask for from your respective running back, and hopefully he finds himself in the end zone or with a good amount of yardage. Moving on, Tevin Coleman's at number 31. I am concerned because it is the New Orleans matchup, but based on the fact that this man is getting the number 1 opportunity, Michael Carter is still injured. I think Ty Johnson's pretty much been irrelevant in the last couple weeks. Why not go ahead, fire up a Tevin Coleman, who was able to get himself 9.2 fantasy points against another one of these great run-stopping defenses like the Philadelphia Eagles. I think he's in a pretty decent spot. Is he an automatic start? Definitely not, because he is a Jets running back, but he could always find himself in the end zone if they get lucky. Moving on to Adrian Peterson, our number 32. Again, currently in the Seattle Seahawks jersey, we have seen him jump around in his career quite a bit here as of late, but he had himself a touchdown. Great father time was with him via hidden gems. But my only concern is if, in fact, they are not giving him touches on the goal line and getting him touchdowns, perhaps he just completely disappears, because his role this last week was as a goal line back and had himself, playing every other drive with Travis Homer kind of, rotating it, Rashad Penny rotating it. We'll get Alex Collins back in this backfield. Hopefully, Adrian Peterson continues to dominate the goal line work, because if that's going to be the case against a team like the Houston Texans, giving up the 5th most points to opposing running backs, by all means, it could be a great play. Moving on to Darrel Williams. Again, despite the fact that he had himself a 9.5 fantasy performance and was honestly at times better than Clyde Edwards this last week, it still does lead to this being a Clyde Edwards-led backfield. That being said, Darrel Williams is going to contribute. The last time he took on the Las Vegas Raiders, had himself a monster performance, and I don't think they're going to just completely force him to vanish out of this entire game plan. He's going to continue to contribute every single week, and as long as that is going to be the case, of course, going against one of the easier defenses. If in fact this team takes an early lead, they'll be running the ball in the second half, killing clock. Moving on to Devin Singletary. He seems to be the starter. Matt Breida's done. Zach Moss is completely just not interesting at all. Devin Singletary would be the only person to score on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers if there would be a possibility from the running back position, mainly out of the receiving game. We'll see how it transpires. Continuing on to J.D. McKissic. If he comes back from a concussion this week, he does certainly have opportunities to catch the ball out of the backfield against the Dallas Cowboys. As even a receiver, they line him up out wide in the slot position. They'll get him involved regardless. Even having two back sets, there's more and more of a threat when you have J.D. McKissic on the field. So certainly could be a great overall play there. Moving on to our final running back option, it is Ameer Abdullah. Like I mentioned earlier this week, if Ameer Abdullah is in the lineup and getting himself, like he has from weeks 8 through 10, a couple catches per week here and there, of course, his fantasy value is going to continue to increase. When he's averaging about 7 to 8 points in those games throughout that 3-week span, I think there's a very good chance that Ameer Abdullah continues to see this kind of opportunity go in his direction. Of course, Cam Newton loves to check down the ball to his respective running backs because, of course, yes, Christian McCaffrey does give them the opportunity to move the ball, but oftentimes Cam Newton just got to get the ball out of his hands because this offensive line cannot block anybody. Either way, Abdullah could be a great play. These are our top 36 running back rankings for week 14 of the 2021 fantasy football season. Do not forget, rankings are subject to change. That is today's video. I appreciate you guys watching, taking the time out of your day to support the channel. Click the like button down below and, of course, subscribe. Tomorrow, we'll talk about the wide receiver position. Hopefully, all the information I presented to you today helps you make a more educated decision as to your Week 14 lineups. Again, do not forget to check out Underdog Fantasy. Use promo code Andrew. There's a link down in the description for those of you interested. This upcoming Thursday night's contest between the Minnesota Vikings and Pittsburgh Steelers should be a lot of fun. Perhaps the Pick'ems contest or even dabble in the NBA, the NHL. A lot of fun to be had there. Check that out. Use promo code Andrew today. Again, thank you everybody for watching. And until tomorrow, I'll see you guys. Peace.